Hello, everyone, and welcome to the midweek program at the Raulston Arboretum. My name is Blake, and I'm the education assistant here at the Arboretum. Today, we got a program for you. Well, okay, it was supposed to be March gardening tasks, Gardening 101, because it's the beginning of March, so we were going to let you know what we do in the garden around March, but we're having a really interesting spring so far this year. Things have started blooming like crazy. We got new growth going right now. It is the 1st of March, and the frost-free date's not until April 15th. So rather than talk about March gardening tasks, today's topic will be protecting plants for cold, which is rather useful right now, considering that we may just get a good cold snap. And so today, Greg is going to talk with you about what to do for preparation for the cold. Okay. And without further ado, I think we will pass things over to Greg so he can tell us what we should do with our plants when the cold invariably comes.
Thank you, Blake. Yes, in reference to my first tour, we might be talking about mid-blooming magnolias at this point. We were just talking before we kick things off. If I had to make a guess, I'd say we're probably 4 to 5 weeks, if not further, into spring than we normally are this time of the year. So one of our volunteers, Carol, who takes care of our plant cart and keeps it stocked and fresh with nice plants, made a very good suggestion. And she said, why don't we do one of these midweeks to talk about what we do with this crazy weather? What should we protect? What should we not be worried about? What are some of the things that we're doing here? So, and we've been getting lots of questions in that regard, both myself via email, people visiting the garden, people coming to the front desk. It's a very hot, no pun intended, topic right now to kind of figure out what are the best things to do to keep your plants safe and happy through this crazy weather. For us being, right at 12-ish acres, we can't wrap everything up in a nice blanket and keep our fingers crossed that the weather's going to behave to that last frost date. Mother Nature doesn't read the rule books, so that last frost date might be further out, it might be further in. My experience in gardening, inevitably, that cold hammer is going to drop and we're going to get another cold snap. As a lover and grower of magnolias most of my life, there's nothing more frustrating than growing magnolias, and that freeze comes through and turns those nice, beautiful bulbs into fleshy, messy, snotty-looking messes hanging off the trees. So it's inevitably going to happen. Don't need to spread doom and gloom, but more than likely that's going to happen. So the reason I'm standing over here is to kind of highlight the first thing is we've seen some winter damage on shrubs. We always anticipate that's going to happen. And most people's inclination is to run out in the garden, take their pruners, clip back all that dead material back, and go through the garden and do a big cleanup. Well, I always try to tell people, be a little bit patient for that inevitable cold snap. And if you prune stuff right now, with it being warm, it's going to want to flush out new growth, and that new growth might potentially be hit. So right next to me is a Sarcococa sweet box. It can typically get hit by some cold weather. You see some brown tips here, and there's not a lot on here. So I would say that it would be okay to prune some of this stuff off. So what you want to do is just go down to where you see some green, try to make a nice pruning cut to a bud, and just clip off that stuff. If it's a little like this, it's okay to do that. If you have a lot of burn, I would wait till we're past that frost date so that it doesn't push new growth. You can see a lot of new buds coming up. You don't want it to push new growth and then it get hit again. It's not so much that first flash of cold weather that damages plants, it's that duration of cold. So if it goes down to 19 degrees and is only down there for a short amount of time, and on cue, there goes our train. So if it's a short duration, there's going to be less damage. It's that long duration of cold that really strikes and harms plants. So in this kind of situation here, that duration was short, so the damage was minimal. And it's not going to make this plant die. It's going to kill this initial foliage. It might stress the plant out a little bit, but this plant's going to fully recover from this. A good example of that, and a better example, is the aforementioned magnolias. When those flowers get burnt from the cold, it doesn't damage the plant, it ruins that flower structure, and it doesn't do damage to that plant tissue. If the duration of cold is much longer, and then that's where you have tissue damage. So this is kind of superficial. So the take-home message with this is, if it's a little bit like this, it's okay to take some of this stuff off, but don't go crazy and start pruning it while you're doing that. If you have a lot of frost damage, wait until we're past that risk of another cold. That way, all that new growth is going to be happy. You're not going to stress the plant out. So that's the take home with this and looking for stuff. Also, kind of in this general area, and thinking about plants here that we worry about, plants you should worry about. We've got a nice boxwood right here, and you can see a lot of new growth. That thing has already pushed open all of its new growth. So if we get another cold snap, the chances of that getting damaged are relatively high. So I mentioned we're a bigger garden than most home gardens. We can't go out and protect all these magnolias. If you had a couple of these in your garden and you wanted to protect those from the cold weather, you could put some kind of covering on that, but it's really important to take that covering off. Put it on at night before the temperature goes down, but take that off in the morning when you're past that cold temperature, because you don't want it to heat up, and that can cause some additional damage. So I'm going to walk over here with a nicer backdrop, and we can talk about some other things. And I've got an example of a piece of fabric that you can use to kind of protect stuff in the garden. So this is just a piece of felt cloth. It's relatively thin. And if you wanted to protect a sacred special shrub in your garden, like the boxwood that I mentioned, you could wrap this around the plant loosely through the night, but be sure to take it off in the morning when the sun comes out. I try to steer people away from using plastic, because if you think about the properties of plastic, if you forget to take that off, you could actually almost literally cook that plant, because it kind of magnifies the heat, doesn't allow the plant to transpire, and keeps all that hot air next to the plant throughout the day. And that's just not a bad situation. A lot of garden centers sell a product called Remay. It's also used for a row cover. It's thinner than this. It's a little more breathable. If you forget to take it off, it's not going to hurt anything. So those are the things that I would steer you towards. Looking at Carol's list, some of the other things that I wanted to mention, other things that might need some protection. I've noticed in our garden, our peonies are coming up, and peonies are usually pretty forgiving with cold weather. Again, going back to that duration of long extended periods of cold, that's where you're going to see more damage. If it's just small dips, peonies are kind of genetically programmed to be okay. People ask about their daffodils. Daffodils can take a lot of cold. We don't worry about protecting them, and I tell people not to worry about those at your home. They're going to kind of be okay throughout the ups and down swings of this weather. One particular perennial that's very sensitive to those changes in temperature are hostas. I've noticed a few in the garden, not many yet, have started to push their little noses up. That is very, very tender foliage. So that's something that with fabric like this or the row cover, you could put down lightly so you're not mashing that new growth down, just to get it through those couple of days. In general, I like to tell people, and myself personally, we garden with tough love here, and I do at home also. Things are kind of left to their own devices in my garden. And we don't do a lot of covering of things. I've got some tender things in containers, and of course those can be lifted and brought inside when you have those crazy swings. The most important thing is just to kind of keep a close eye on the weather and what's going on with that. Thinking about conifers, that's the thing that we get a lot of questions about, broadleaf evergreens. And if you wanted to pan over to right next to Blake, we've got a podocarpus right here that has kind of a nice rusty brown color associated with it. And on my caffeine-induced walk through the gardens in the morning, whipping through here really quickly, you would look at that and think that that's been burnt by the cold, but that's a little bit of winter color. Not to say that there isn't some winter damage in there, but this goes back to the point I made earlier of having some patience in the garden and just kind of watching things, waiting till we're well past that last frost date before we start pruning, and giving conifers a chance to kind of regreen, resprout. That same thing goes with palms, with other things that are kind of broadleafed and evergreen in your garden. I've noticed hollies have started to leaf out and flower. Those are some other things that are a little more forgiving, and just kind of think about those and be patient as you're kind of going along. I always get asked a lot about fig trees and things that are forming those big fleshy buds. I had some friends when I lived in Philadelphia that grew those a little bit out of their range, and they had a whole system of covering, like the felt and the rime, that they would cover that plant with just to protect it when those dips will go down. So I know a lot of people grow figs here. That's something to be cautious and careful of and think about. But also when you're planning for new things in your garden, think about things that are a little more cold tolerant. Think about taking advantage of microclimates in your yard. We do that a lot here, but we'll put things that are a little more tender in corners where they're out of the wind, or where they're going to take advantage of the reflected heat from a building per se, or a wall. Those are some things you can do preemptively when you're adding new plants to your garden. But that's kind of the gist of what I wanted to run through, and the great tips that we got from Carol. I don't know if we've got anybody bubbling in with questions or comments yet.
Yeah, for sure. A couple people were asking, can we cover shrubs with an old sheet if you don't have?
Absolutely. Covering things like that, that's almost kind of a Southern tradition. You expect to ride around and see people drying their laundry on their plants when they're really trying to protect stuff. A sheet is a good thing to use because it's not heavy, it's a little more breathable, but it's important to take that off in the morning when the temperature starts to rise, so that you're not giving that plant more heat and almost creating a greenhouse effect where you're perpetuating more of a problem. Don't use pieces. I've seen people put pieces of carpet, anything heavy that's going to damage that new tissue, especially perennials and things like that. The row cover, the rime fabric, that's the best stuff that I've seen that you can purchase. A lot of garden centers will sell that. It folds down really small, doesn't take up a lot of space. It's always good to have that if you're worried about plants in your garden, and I would lean more towards that. Stay away from tarps, plastic sheeting. We'll cover up some perennials here that we know are going to be tender with Christmas greens, or things that we prune just to kind of lay on the plant to kind of trick it to keep it more warm as things kind of emerge, almost giving it some extra layer in the ground. Other kind of tricks that we've done in the past, and I learned this from Doug when I worked with him, protecting tropicals with compost, putting a cage around bananas and tender things like cannas, filling that with compost. If you've got a banana stalk, cover that top with a plant pot so that water doesn't seep down, and that compost as it's heating up will kind of protect it, and your bananas have a bit of an extra jump in the spring.
Cool, yeah. Somebody asked, with like that boxwood over there when it's in that stage of growth, like at what temperature would you start worrying about it that you need to cover it?
Dipping down below freezing, again, it's all about that duration, that length of cold saturation that's going to cause actual tissue damage, and how much growth has occurred. I wouldn't worry about that unless we're going to get down into the 20s for a longer extended period of time. And again, there's no way we can run around the garden and cover ours. But if you've got 1, 2, 3, 5 in your garden, that's an easy thing to cover up with that rime fabric just to get through that duration. They make frost blankets. I've seen those at some garden centers that have actual stakes in them that will also work. But I wouldn't worry about the boxwoods until we're going to get down well below freezing for an extended period of time.
Okay. Somebody says that they've read that making sure things are hydrated helps prevent or mitigate cold damage. Could you speak on that for a little bit?
That's a really good point. A lot of our broadleaf evergreens, when we plant them in the fall, get them kind of established before they go to sleep for the winter, they're not going to show signs of stress like a deciduous plant would. So being sure that you hydrate at planting and even through the winter, it's important that if we're not getting rainfall, and this winter, and I think mostly because we decided to do the project where we're moving soil, it's rained pretty much at least every week, if not every other week. So we're getting enough rainfall. But if those broadleaf evergreens have enough moisture, they're not going to be stressed. They're not going to be needing moisture. And the wind of the winter, the cold temperatures, those swings, which also stress it out, if they're hydrated, that's one less cultural factor that's going to keep those plants healthy and going strong.
Okay. Well, somebody asked, so what if you've covered your plants and then it starts raining? What do you do then?
That's often a concern, especially with any kind of fabric, is covering up your plants. And if you've got something that's got weight to it, you can almost cause damage as it's kind of pulling itself down and adding to the stress of that. So if that wet fabric freezes, and that's a whole nother can of worms. Something like the felt that I mentioned, the row cover, that's a little porous. It's much lighter weight, and it's not going to be as much of an issue as a sheet, or I've seen people put towels out or a blanket or something like that. So that is the concern. And more than likely, if it's raining, it's not below freezing, so you could, in essence, take that off. But snow acts as an insulator if we get that much snow, and let's not even talk about that and jinx ourselves so that we don't. That's the last thing I want to see happen, is to get a snowstorm between now and that last frost date. But that's a good question. You can cause damage to things and pull things apart with wet fabric.
Sure. Someone's asking for a bit of clarification. When you say extended cold, how long do you mean?
So a lot of times particularly this time of the year, when we're kind of having this pseudo spring, it might go down to 32 degrees and kind of stay there. And we're not going to have a lot of damage there. Below that is where we start to have problems. So when I'm talking about extended cold, I'm talking about several hours, long enough to cause serious damage to tissue. There's moisture in plants right now that's coming up from the roots and going into the plants. And that moisture can actually freeze. And when water freezes, it expands. And when it expands in plant tissue, it causes cells to explode, bark to peel off. So extended is more than 3-4 hours. We had an Easter cold snap 2006, 2007, where we had temperatures in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and then it went down to 19 degrees for about 6-7 hours. That's an extended period of cold that caused a lot of havoc. And there aren't enough fabrics to cover things up to prevent that from happening, unfortunately.
Okay, so you talked a bit about reactionary pruning. When something gets cold and it's got damaged, you might not want to prune it. What about stuff that you normally would be pruning this time of year? Is it too warm to do it now? Should you wait, or? With this crazy, this is the new norm. Having these big swings, having loropetalum bloom, in early February. This is the earliest I think I've ever seen our native redbuds bloom. You mentioned something blooming, Bradford pear, not to talk about a horrible plant, but that's been blooming its head off for weeks now, in early February. I think things that we used to do early, like some spring pruning, we need to push back, a couple weeks just to protect things from pushing out more, and then that new growth ultimately getting damaged. You're not gonna hurt
some things, woody things that haven't leafed out yet, I think it's okay to do that. A little bit of structural pruning, you're not going to hurt things. A little bit of what I showed with the sarcococca, you're not going to cause a lot of damage. Roses are something that we prune back this time of the year. You're not going to hurt those. I would say keep doing that. But I would, we need to push our garden task calendar a little bit further in the northerly direction, just because of this is the new normal spring, I think.
Okay. Someone's asking some questions about some specific plants. They're concerned about Weigelia, bridal wreath, spirea, hydrangeas, begonias, and columbine. Shall they worry about those, or?
Columbine is pretty cold adaptable. It's a perennial. I wouldn't worry about that. We've got some Weigelia starting to bloom here, and that's a relatively high tolerant plant. But again, that's a cold duration thing. If we dip down and you've got a prize Weigelia in your yard, that might be something you want to think about protecting. The spirea, the bridal veil one, that's an early bloomer. That's a tried and true kind of a heirloom plant. That one's pretty tolerant. The only kind of cold damage I would see on that is the flowers might get burnt, but not the plant itself. Most of those are gonna be okay, I think.
Okay. I'll ask a question. So at peach orchards and stuff, when it gets to freezing, they'll pull out the irrigation system and run the irrigation all night long. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, so our neighbors to the south in South Carolina, and we've got a lot of peach growers in North Carolina too, we've got peaches in the garden that are flowering. So if our peaches are flowering, their peaches are starting to flower. So if your life is hinged on that one crop, it's of major concern, and you're gonna have some countermeasures to help with those crazy kind of temperature swings. So they use two things to kind of help reverse those deep cold pitches. One are smudge pots, which are just basically lanterns that heat up. They'll place them through an orchard, and what they're in essence doing is causing a warm inversion through the orchard, so that warm air kind of stays hovered and helps protect those flowers. They're suited up to do that. They've got those kind of smudge pots. They know how to put those things out. Another thing that they can do, and I know strawberry growers will do this also, is turn the irrigation system on. It'll cover the plants with a coat of water. That water will freeze instantly, and you're in essence insulating those flower parts, the fruiting structures, the plant tissue with a coat of ice that helps insulate that plant. We don't have a system like that here. Most of us at home can't do that. So those are kind of exceptions to the rule. I would not want to be somebody that grows peaches. I just saw in the news recently that the almonds are flowering in California, the earliest they've ever flowered. That's a huge economic boon to certain parts of California. They're getting snow in places they've never gotten snow before. So they've got things that they can do to help protect that sort of stuff. It would be nice to have a big plastic shell to plop on our gardens and get us through these crazy methods, but we don't have that sort of avenue. Not quite yet. Not quite yet.
Okay. So it looks like the only other question we have left, someone asked, what are those white flowers behind you? Those are Camellia japonica, white by the gate, as we mentioned before.
We specifically wanted to be someplace outside where we had some nice backdrop. So two different camellias. We've got an Edgeworthia over here. I'm embarrassed to say we're sitting behind, being a huge plant snob, some nice forsythia. But that's one of the finest indicators of spring from coast to coast in the United States. And what's not to love about that bright yellow flower this time of the year? Lots of stuff in bloom kind of prematurely here. It's well worth a visit. As I sit here, our signature Chinese sassafras is in full bloom, a lot of loropetalum flowering. Way too many magnolias for my taste to be open and kind of doing their thing. I walked by a Weigelia opening up, all of our Asian red buds are starting to show color. It's on. It's time to come out and take a gander at stuff blooming, and
Okay.
hope it doesn't get cold.
We did get a couple more questions
Sure.
came in. Somebody wanted to transplant their strawberry plants. Should they go ahead or should they wait?
That's something I know nothing about, strawberries. You know, if you have them, if you can plant them in something that you can move, if you're putting them in the ground and you've got some of that row cover, if it's a raised bed in particular, it's going to be easier to protect those. I would say go ahead and transplant. If you've got them in little pots that you just bought at your garden center and you haven't put them out yet, keep them someplace where they're getting sun, where you can water them so they don't dry out. I would hold off a little bit. You know, it's nice that we've got all these apps and different weather venues to check and keep a close eye on the weather, but things change relatively quickly. You know, I long-term looking into next week, I didn't see anything dipping down below freezing, but if you haven't planted them yet, they're still in a pot, they're going to be okay for several more weeks in that situation. Just don't let them dry out. Just don't forget to bring them inside if it's going to get cold. If you're planting them in a container or one of those tomato pots or strawberry pots, you can pick that up and move that around. You know, if it's not absolutely backbreakingly heavy, but if you still got them in the pots from the garden center, I would wait a few more weeks. Same with tomatoes, same with vegetables. You know, all that stuff is out in the big box stores and other places. Just resist the temptation for a few more weeks and err on the side of closer to that frost-free date.
Okay. There's another question here. Do you have any suggestions for blackberry and blueberry bushes that have started budding?
Same thing with those. If you haven't planted them yet, keep them going. If they're in your garden and you've only got a couple, keep an eye on the weather. Blueberries are really, really tough. If you think about where they grow, a lot of them are native to our mountains here in North Carolina. You know, they're pretty tough plants. I noticed some here have started to flower, but I haven't seen any fruit form yet. Blackberries are another tender berry. If you've got them, don't put them out yet. If you've got them in your garden, kind of keep an eye on them. And it would behoove you to have some of that row cover remake fabric that if we're going to get into a pinch, you can at least cover them up in hopes that you'll protect them from too deep of a dive into cold weather.
Okay, so there's two more questions that are, okay. Well, I kind of like to wrap this up at around 30 minutes. So would you just speak about, as for planting stuff right now, any concerns?
As long as things are going to get watered, they're going to be fine. You know, that's a huge thing is all those cultural follow-ups when you plant. So disturbing the root ball so that you're breaking up those girdling roots, planting at the right depth so you're not covering the root flare, watering in so you get rid of air pockets and that root ball is getting nice and saturated, filling back in and tamping your soil, not with your foot, you know, nice and firm, covering up with 2 to 3 inches of mulch, not around the root flare, so that it's got the organic matter, it's going to protect it from the cold, it's going to keep the moisture in and around it, and give it supplemental water as kind of that root ball dries out. You know, things should be okay. We're getting ready to do a big planting project at our research nursery out in Lake Wheeler next week. A lot of that's going to be bare root stuff, so it's still kind of dormant. Some of it's going to be container stuff, big and small, but we're going to follow all those cultural practices. You know, we're planting in good soil. We're going to have cover so that the roots are protected. We're going to water them in heavily after we plant them, and we're going to keep a close eye on the weather to see if we need to get the irrigation going and have it ready so that all that stuff's in place so that we don't stress things out. You know, fall is a better time to plant because things are still kind of dormant, but you can certainly plant in the spring as long as you're following up. It just needs a little more eyes on the garden and the plants this time of the year, particularly with woodies. You know, soft, tender things, hostas and begonias and things like that, I would wait till we're a little bit closer to that frost-free date. Just because it's in the garden centers and the big box stores, It doesn't mean it's ready to go into the ground. Just because your neighbor planted all of her petunias and all those other things, little bit of patience. Wait and see what the weather's going to do. Today's the 1st of March. We're not quite there yet. You can take a chance, and chances are we're not going to dip down, but knock on wood, I think it's inevitable. We're going to get, I hope we don't get any white stuff, but I think we're going to get another big, deep swing into cold temperatures well before April. I hate to say that, but I think it's going to happen.
Sure. Okay, and I will end with this last question, and only because it's pertaining to magnolias and only because it's directed towards Greg, who will be leading us on our Plant Lovers Tour next week. So, which magnolia is more vulnerable, stellata or solangiana? And is it just the flowers that are damaged or tissue and future leaves?
In 90% of the cases with magnolias, it's just the flower itself that gets burnt. When you see those brown flowers on a plant, it hasn't damaged the leaf buds, most likely. It hasn't damaged the tissue in the trunk. It's just those flowers. That tissue is much more tender and prone to doing that, and those reproductive parts of the plant itself. In my experience, and I think it's because they bloom a little bit earlier, some of the stellatas come out earlier, and they get zoinked pretty quickly. But it depends on where they are in the garden. It depends on how tall they are, how big they are, which cultivar. Some cultivars are a little more tolerant than others. And so I've seen solangiana come out before stellata. So it kind of depends on what's out there right now. Not to say that if we get into an extended cold snap this time of the year when things are pushing. I mentioned that Easter cold snap in 2006, 2007. I'm terrible with years. We had crepe myrtles that the bark slid off, and right next to it, one was fine. We had magnolias where the bark exploded off the plants, and ones that were fine, just a few feet up where the inversion of cold is in lower parts of the garden. So that's a contributing factor too, is kind of the lay of your land. If you've got low spots in your garden, warm air rises and that cold will settle. So you're gonna have more damage in those areas where things are a little bit lower. Our magnolia collection here is kind of in a high corner of the garden. So things there kind of escape that some of that crazy weather. Just down from that area, heading down to the corner of Barrow where we're doing a lot of work right now, there's a lot of magnolias and it's lower. And I've noticed those from previous visits, those are the first ones that get hit. So it's that kind of, that elevation. So there's no plug and play answer for the part of the country that you might be in. It's temperature, duration of cold, where, and cultivar that really make the differences.
Great. Okay. Well,
and we'll talk more about that when you come for a tour.
yeah, absolutely. Great. And yeah, thank you so much for doing
Thank
this,
you.
Greg. The chat is filling up with expressions of gratitude. So this seems to be the right topic
Awesome.
for today. So
Cool.
thanks for doing that, Greg. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in today for this one. We hope you'll join us next week. The schedule says that Mark's going to be doing a talk on his trip to Vietnam. That's what the schedule says, but sometimes Mark likes to keep things a little loosey-goosey. So we'll see how reality actually manifests itself next week. So I hope you all will join us next Wednesday at 3 o'clock, and we'll see you then. Take care.